Your central thesis that museums are under attack.
Well, that's a starting point. They certainly are under attack. And I'm interested in why and what's to be done. And there are two issues that really obsessed me when I was writing the book. The one is the whole demand for repatriation of certain museum objects.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one, which I find more important and more urgent, is what is a museum of anthropology going to be about in the 21st century? What is its subject matter? What does it deal with?
Mm-hmm.
What is it trying to explain and use its collections to illuminate? And how is it going to go about that? So these are the two questions which I look at, first of all, historically, and then in the current moment.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Well, let's see if we can sort of deal with those in terms. When it comes to sort of the kind of decisions museums are making at the moment, can you give me some examples of ones that you would regard as being sort of overcautious, mistaken?
Well, you mentioned the Benin Bronzers,
Mm-hmm.
and that's now become an iconic example of this sort of problem. I think that each of these issues has to be looked at on its own terms, in context, case by case. And one of the key problems with the Benin Bronzers, which were taken from what is now a Nigerian kingdom in the 1890s by force, by military force, three questions you ask is, who is claiming them?
Mm-hmm.
What will they do with them? And is it going to be used in a responsible way in which the international interest in these objects will be safeguarded? So the National Museum of Nigeria in Lagos has several hundred Benin Bronzers, of which practically none are on show and have been on show for the last 20, 30 years.
And these are basically equivalent items to the ones in dispute.
There's an overlap.
Right.
Some of them are rather later, but they were made by the same guilds and the same sort of subject matter. And the reason is that this museum is extremely insecure. There have been large-scale thefts from the museum over time, and it's very understaffed. An English journalist who was there recently spoke to the director of the museum, and she told him that they have on average 30 visitors a day, mostly school parties. So are you going to give the Benin Bronzers to that museum? That would be a bad idea. So in the Edo province, where Benin City is in Nigeria, the state, the local governor and the local entrepreneur have said, well, we're setting up a charitable trust and we're going to build a museum. We've got a plan for it here. And this museum is going to be dedicated largely to these Benin Bronzers. Give it to us. And then the Oba of Benin, the king of Benin, said, oh, wait a minute. I don't know who these people are who are claiming to have these things. They belong to my family. They were stolen from the royal court. And I'm going to set up a museum in which these are going to be identified. So a European museum or college or whatever who's saying, we feel very guilty about these Benin Bronzers, we're going to give them back. Who are they going to give them back to?
So the point being that these are decisions made for our benefit rather than anybody else's benefit.
Well, it's both. I mean, I think you've got to look at it case by case.
Well, Geoffrey Robertson, the human rights lawyer, he
Yes.
says that the trustees of the British Museum have become the world's largest receivers of stolen property. Would you say that is untrue or just irrelevant?
Hyperbole.
Hyperbole. Okay.
Yes. A lot of the things that are in the great world museums, some of them got there in a shady sort of way. Some of them it's very ambiguous, like the Elgin marbles. Did Lord Elgin really get the permission that he claimed he'd got from the emperor of the Ottoman Empire? And is that enough justification to have them? Is there another argument, even if they're legally in the British Museum? If there's another kind of argument you could make to give them to the new museum in Athens, the Parthenon Museum in Athens? You've got to look at all these things one at a time, but to say that everything is stolen is a bit wrong. I mean, take another iconic object in the British Museum, the Rosetta Stone. That was discovered by Napoleon's troops during the invasion of Egypt, sort of just not belonging to anybody, just sort of hanging around in a building, in part of a wall. And they took it out, and it was taken from them by the British. The ship was intercepted by a British ship and was shipped to the British Museum. Well, okay, Is it stolen? Isn't it stolen? Who has a claim on it?
Is it stolen or is it rescued? I guess is the question. But so, look, what does this mean long term for like a British, indeed a Western museum? Because if I mean, do correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but if we're talking about every item considered in not in isolation, but considered on its own relative merits about where it should go and who has a claim to it, and how safe it'll be when it gets there and how many people will see it and so on. Presumably, if one takes a sort of Panglossian view of the world, there will come a point where every country on Earth is theoretically capable of having an institution to rival the British Museum. At that point, what is the purpose of the British Museum?
At that point, what is the purpose of a national museum?
Yeah.
All these museums would then, in this Panglossian world that you're counting, they would all be just national myth museums.
Right.
And that brings me to the second argument I want to
Sure.
make. I'm interested in a kind of museum which would show the connections between different groups of peoples and different kinds of cultural traditions, different kinds of artistic conditions. To take the Benin Bronzers again. Benin Bronzers are made in the context of a trade with Europe, which begins in the 16th century with the Portuguese. And it is after the Portuguese introduced copper and guns into this area in exchange for slaves largely, that you began to have the bronze makers, the statue makers in the area. And who are they modeling it on? First of all, they're interested in European models, but they're also interested in Ife, which is another Nigerian state not far away, which has its own wonderful traditions of artistic work. They're also, and they've been for several centuries, in contact with the Islamic states in the Sahel, Timbuktu, for example. So there are a series of exchanges all being made. And if you look at the Benin Bronzers, even some in the 17th century, they are of Portuguese soldiers, Portuguese knights. They're showing an interaction, a connection. Some of the things are made, particularly some of the ivory carvings, are made for export to Portugal. The salt cellars made in the form of a Portuguese knight.
So there's a danger in considering them to be national talismans, because then you lose the
lose the contact, you lose the understanding. They have to be shown in context. And I think that the British Museum has failed in this. And the British Museum, for example, even if you look at its classical Greek and Roman collections, they're not shown in relationship to each other, nor are they shown in relationship to contemporary work in Assyria, further abroad. I want to see a 21st century museum, which is a museum about the connections and contacts and exchanges between peoples globally, for a global audience who comes there. 70% of the visitors to the British Museum are tourists. These are international museums. I also want to see international consortia of museums loaning things to each other, organizing collaborative exhibits which travel around, and exchange curators. And British Museum already has a good program of training curators from around the world. This should be institutionalized as part of the mission of all the great metropolitan museums.
Does it worry you? I mean, we're very out of time, but does it worry you that then, so our current understanding, or our growing understanding often of what's going on in museums, that they are essentially full of plunder that must be repatriated? This is going to do huge damage to sort of our understanding of our global heritage.
Not only that, it's a complete myth that a large proportion of the collections of the major museums are stolen or got by some kind of fraudulent way. It's nonsense.